And the occasion is fortuitous for us visit to Toronto by an activist with the RMT, one of the leading unions in London workplaces, in British workplaces. They have more than one union quite often. In the London Underground, which is the word for subway and also the public transit system, there are a number of unions. But the critical one, the one that's the largest, but also the one that's been the most active, is called the RMT, and its leader for a long time just died last year, Bob Crow, you might have heard of it, and one of the leading activists from that union, Janine Booth, is visiting relatives. So Janine has happily volunteered to do a session with us.
Really pleased to be here, partly because I'm having a fabulous holiday. Staying in Scarborough, so I think I recognise that description of it being, as you put, transit desert. Yes. It does. One of the things that struck all of us about being here is that Toronto appears to be a very car-reliant, car-dominated city. Less so now we're downtown, but certainly in a few days we're spent in Scarborough. Thank you for saying that the stuff you can learn from what's happening in London. I think that's true, but I'm very keen to learn from you guys as well. I've already been scribbling down things about educationals on public transport vehicles. What a fantastic idea. Leaving people at bus stops and stuff. Yeah, we'll definitely take those ideas back with me. Did I also hear someone say that the person in charge of transport here is Andy Byford?
Yes.
Is that yes. Our Andy Byford?
Yes.
You're Andy Byford.
That's our Andy Byford. I think John...
You remember him very well.
John knows him better than me. John will have sat opposite him at the negotiating table between the unions and the bosses on London Underground.
He's got his little coterie of folks that he brought with him. So.
Yeah, we do export our transit bosses around the country to go and wreck public services in other places, based on the experience they have now.
No, he's not ours anymore.
So, so just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm sorry if this sounds like a boring list of committees. I'm not as boring as it makes me sound. So my job is I work as a station supervisor on London Underground. So if you're ever coming through Bank Monument Station, come say hello. I'm active in the RMT trade union. I have been a full-time union rep and national executive member in the past, but now I go to work for a living, and I'm the branch secretary of the Central Line East branch. I think you call them locals over here rather than branches. The Central Line East local, then. I'm also a member of the European Transport Workers Federation's Women's Committee, so that's like a federal union body of transport unions right across Europe, and it has a women's committee. And I also wanted to mention, because it's relevant, that so we have the Trade Union Congress is our federal body of all trade unions in Britain. It has a disabled workers committee, and I'm the co-chair of that. And the reason I mention that is that one of the main issues we campaign on is disabled people's access, or lack of, to public transport. And we're very, very clear that accessible transport means publicly owned, properly funded transport. And the final thing I want to mention is I'm also a member of a small Marxist organisation called Workers' Liberty. We have an annual kind of summer discussion weekend, and the one we had about a month ago, we did a session on what would public transport be like if workers were in control. And the speakers were me and Herman. Herman was on the video. He sent us a video over it. It was a really good, very good discussion. I was pleasantly surprised when you said that the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly decided that transit was the issue to make a big campaign over, and that we unite them. Because actually in our country, I don't think the left doesn't talk that much about transport. It's much more likely to go on to organise around issues like health or education. I think it's good that I want to see people see transport as much as a public service issue as those are. So, London Underground. Let me tell you a little bit about London Underground. A couple of years ago, London Underground celebrated its 105th birthday. It's the oldest underground railway system in the world. And having kind of studied a bit of that history, so it was set up by private companies, separate lines, separate companies. They started to kind of coordinate together from 1908 onwards. By the 1920s, it was kind of chaotic, and eventually in the 1930s, it was brought into public ownership under the London Passenger Transport Board, but in quite unsatisfactory form of public ownership. So it came into public ownership, they set up a board to run it, and they filled the board with all the previous private owners, and they gave them dividends. So for a while it wasn't a lot better in public ownership than it had been before, but under pressure from unions and passengers rioting at bus stops, things like that, it did become better, and they brought in a thing called the New Works programme, which saw lines extended and new stations built and the old steam lines electrified and that kind of thing. And it's particularly worth mentioning that because something similar had happened in the 20s when it was still private as well. This relates to what a lot of socialists have always argued about how to deal with economic recession, and one of the ways you should deal with economic recession is through public works. Instead of just making a working class pay for the ruling class's economic failures, have a programme where money is invested into public services to not only help rebuild the economy, but to provide employment, to provide jobs at a time of high unemployment. And that happened with the New Works programme. In 1948, the first ever majority Labour government brought the entire railway system into national public ownership, which was a fantastic thing. It did a bit of a bad thing for London Underground though, because it put London Underground into that same national control, so it no longer had a London focus. The New Works programme stopped and funding was just a bit rubbish for a long time after that, and there was a period of decline throughout the 50s and the 60s. Then you got a new council body set up in London in the 60s and into the 70s. Things got a bit better, and then Margaret Thatcher's Tories got elected. Everything went bad in every respect. So into the 1980s you had, there was the first serious attempt to have really low fares on London Underground when the Labour run, by Labour I mean Labour Party, I think you mean, trying to get the terminology right here, introduced a policy called Fares Fair, which meant massively subsidised low pay, but a Tory council took them to court and the court declared it illegal, and the Labour Greater London Council sort of gave in to that and doubled the fares again. But under the Tory years, funding became much lower. It also became more unreliable. So there was a yearly grant. So London Underground was only told year by year how much funding it would get. So it couldn't plan any long-term improvements or long-term projects. And also, the other thing the Tory government did was it started the process of privatisation and fragmentation of the Underground. So they privatised loads of stuff during the 80s, you know, coal, telecoms, gas, water, anything that moved or even stuff that didn't move, they would sell. Some things they realised they couldn't quite sell. They couldn't just privatise schools or hospitals or London Underground. So what they did is they found other ways of inviting the private sector in. And that's the origin of what you guys call P3s, that we would call PFI, Private Finance Initiative, or PPP, which I think is what P3 means anyways, in public-private partnership. It's a way of letting private sector vultures peck at, bite chunks out of the public services that the government doesn't feel it's politically able to just sell wholesale. So, for instance, from the 1980s, the Building and Works Department was privatised, the station cleaning was privatised. No accident now that while London Underground workers who are still in the public sector have comparable to other working class people, pretty good pay and conditions. The station cleaners are employed by horrible multinational cowboy contractors like, you probably have them over here as well, the Interserve and ISS and companies like that. Yeah. Okay, and half of them aren't even employed by them. They're with agencies and they're brought in from that, and they're on minimum wage, they're on very few rights, they work in appalling conditions. Okay, and I should pause at this moment to tell you Janine's theory of the 5 factors. So, I reckon, having looked at the 150-year history of London Underground, that there are 5 factors that tell you how well London Underground does as a transit system at any given time, right? So 1, ownership. It does better when it is publicly owned. It's a better system when it's publicly owned than when it's privately owned. Secondly, funding. It won't surprise you at all to know that it does better when its funding is reliable and relatively high than when it's rubbish and occasional. Coherence, okay, so it does better when it's considered as a united system rather than when it's fragmented by different lines, by contracting out, etc. Fourthly, governance. Interestingly enough, London Underground does better when it's under the control of a London body rather than a UK-wide body. It does. Sometimes we had local government in London. The Tories abolished it. We didn't even have London local government for ages. We have it again now. London Underground does better when it's run by a London body than when it's run by the government. It would do better still if that body was elected. So usually it's run by a transport committee that's appointed by the elected body. I think it would be better still if it was run by an elected body. And fifthly, the fifth factor is ethos, which is a slightly less tangible one than the others. One of the first things the Tories did to London Underground in the 1980s was they changed its name from London Underground to London Underground Limited. So it wasn't privatised, but it was made to act as though it were a private. So it was like a private company, but the government was its sole owner. But they said, you must run like a business. You must try to make your books balance. Okay? So those are the 5 factors. By the time we got to our so the other thing I should mention that the Tories did is they privatised the national railway system. So, you know, I told you the Labour government brought it into public ownership in 1948. British Rail is now divided up into Virgin trains and all franchised out, etc. So by the time we came to the 1997 general election, everyone had had enough of the Tories by then. They'd been in power 18 years and they were voted out and Labour got elected. Now the Tories' policy for the Underground that they'd taken into that general election was to wholesale privatise it. Very unpopular policy. Labour won the general election by a landslide and actually even got more of a swing in London, which might have been the additional unpopularity of the Tories' privatisation policy. But Labour's policy was quite vague. They said we'll have a public-private partnership. Now that term wasn't established at the time with a definite meaning. It just meant a vague idea of the public and the private working together. But we all thought, great, well at least it's not privatisation. Then they decided what this PPP was actually going to be. And they spent their first year in office working out what it was going to be, and they set up a little team. Now you might think that a Labour government, i.e. a government of the party set up by trade unions to represent the interests of working people, if it was going to put together a little team of people to work out the best policy of the Underground, you might think it would invite what? Workers, passengers, working class people, socialists? No, they got a bunch of businessmen, including ones who had helped the Tories privatise public services in the 1980s, and sent them away for a year and said, come back with a policy. And surprise, surprise, they came back with a policy that said, it'd be really good if you get the private sector involved. And the actual policy they came up with, okay, they said, one of the things, what I should mention, because I think this argument gets used the world over, they kind of pushed it on the basis of there is no alternative. So all the arguments they would say, is like, they dismissed the idea of being publicly owned and directly funded by the government as though it was just impossible. They never even said why it was impossible. They just said, well, obviously we're not going to have that, so we're going to have something else. And they said, well, this is the best thing because all the stations are falling apart and all the signalling's rubbish, it all needs upgrading. And obviously the government's not going to fund this. This is the government saying this, by the way. Saying, well, obviously the government's not going to. Well, you are the government. You could do this if you wanted to. So we're going to have to find private money. And I think one of the things that's important, the real sleight of hand here, and I still wonder to this day how they got away with it, there is no such thing as private funding of public services. The private sector is not a charity. It doesn't hand over money just because it feels like it. It hands over money only if it knows it's going to get more money back, right? There is such a thing as private finance, but funding and finance are two very different things. Funding is where the money comes from. Finance is how it comes. So private finance doesn't mean the private sector is giving you money. It just means the money you're getting is coming through the private sector. It's still coming from the public sector. It's just they're creaming off a load of it on the way. So the actual structure they used is they said, right, we'll keep the operation of the Underground in the public sector, stations, the signalling, the trains. But a maintenance, both maintenance and renewal, so both day-to-day maintenance and improvements, whatever, will be awarded on a 30-year lease, if you like, a PPP contract, and we'll have a bidding process to determine who's going to do it. And some of the names I've heard mentioned at this meeting so far were in there. Bechtel, Amy, Balfour Beatty, they're all in there. Yeah. And they had a bidding process which was ridiculously stacked in favour of the, I mean, any bidding process is going to be stacked in favour of the private sector. But this was stacked in their favour so much that they basically wrote the contract. So the contracts, which are incredibly thick and complicated, ridiculously bureaucratic contracts anyway, the contracts made the public sector liable for 95% of the debt of the private contractor. Okay. So, they announced this policy in 1998, they wanted to bring it in 2000. They didn't actually manage to get it in until 2003 because it was rubbish, but also because there was a big fight against it. So we set up the union set up a group called Campaign Against Tube Privatisation that went out campaigning. We fought it industrially, we had lots of days of strike action, I can't remember how many. And we kind of knocked it back in terms of time, and we won important protections for workers. So we won, for instance, there's a no compulsory redundancies policy on London Underground. Nobody can be made compulsory redundant. And that was a policy we won as in part of the fight against the PPP. But we didn't stop the PPP itself. We did a lot of campaigning within the Labour Party as well. An awful lot of Labour MPs, councillors, rank and file members, Labour affiliated trade unions were against the PPP, but Tony Blair knew best. Like Tony Blair knows best about everything. And they were not going to listen to their own rank and file, let alone to common sense or anything. By the time this PPP came in, right, nobody was in favour of it except the government that was bringing it in and the private companies that were going to make profit out of it. And they were only in favour, they didn't think it was a good idea, they just thought they'd make a lot of profit out of it. So despite our really quite good in a lot of ways fight against it, I should mention, let me just tell you a little bit about the unions on the Underground. There are 4 trade unions on the Underground. There's the RMT, which myself and John are active in. The RMT is the biggest. It's also the only one that organises across all grades of workers. Then you've got ASLEF, which represents only train drivers, and probably a bit more than half of the train drivers are in ASLEF, and nearly all the rest are in the RMT. Then you have a union called the TSSA, which is more a kind of its background is a clerical grades union, but it also has station staff in it as well. Reputation of not being militant. It's become more so recently, which is good to see, but for a long time the standing joke was that TSSA stood, which actually stands for Transport Salaried Staffs Association, actually stood for Too Scared for Strike Action. And then you've got some engineering workers who, rather than being in a railway union because they work on the railway, are in an electricians union because they're an electrician. So that they are in what is now called Unite the Union. At the time it was called the Confed. So we had our strikes and stuff. Basically, Unite and TSSA never went on strike against the PPP at all. RMT did and ASLEF did, but kind of ASLEF joined in a bit after RMT started and left before RMT finished. By all means, what I'll do is I've brought these pamphlets along that you can have just for free. So Workers' Liberty, the group that I've introduced this pamphlet after this was all over about the union. That's got a lot of detail about the union's fight against it and what was good and what was not so good about that. So it came in, 4 years later it began to collapse. So 4 years after these 30-year contracts were signed, one of the 2 contract holders went bankrupt, owing £2 billion. Remember what I said about 95% liability for that being with the public sector. So it cost the public sector a fortune, and the companies, the big name multinational companies that were part of that contract, walked away laughing and went and got jobs doing things like probably running Toronto's TTC. There's certainly one of them running Metropolitan Transport in Sydney, Australia. They went away trousers stuffed full of money, having been not held accountable at all for the mess they'd made of the Underground. The other one of these infracos, they called them, public contract holders, was brought back into public ownership in 2010, and at that point, that's it, PPP over. And you won't find anyone now who's got anything good to say about it. Well, you might look very odd. But it's like consensus now, what a load of rubbish that policy was. So it's all back in public ownership. Look, those core bits are back in public ownership now. There's still the contracted out bits. What's happening now is the Tories are again, both in London government and in national government. In the process of closing all the ticket offices on the Underground. A year ago, every single station had a ticket office. Now they're halfway through closing all of them. They're trying to get rid of 800 station staff. We're in the middle of a campaign of strikes at the moment where actually, certainly for the first time in my memory, probably even longer, certainly the first time since I've been on the job, and I've been on the job 18 years, all 4 unions are going out to strike together. So on last Thursday, Underground shut off the entire land because of united strike action. So that's what's happening now. The conclusion, I think, in terms of lessons learned is to go back to the 5 factors. You know, we want our urban public transport to be publicly owned, well-funded, unified, run by a democratic body of the area that it operates in, and we want it to be allowed to operate as a public service, not as a kind of fake private business in the public sector. Further than that, I think we have to remember that even when it is publicly owned, it can still be a bit rubbish. British Rail wasn't brilliant. If it's run bureaucratically, just by government apparatchiks, it's not necessarily going to respond to working class people's needs. So I think we need to call for more than just public ownership and good funding. What we actually want is public transport run under democratic workers and passengers control. Because we're the people who know what we want the system to look like. The passengers, and by the term passengers I include people who would be passengers if they could afford it or if they could get up and down the stairs or whatever. Passengers know what kind of system they want and need. The workers are committed to that, otherwise they wouldn't have got a job in that industry in the first place, and they have the technical knowledge. So I think what we need is democratic workers and passengers control, and then you can just think, wow, think what would we do with your transport system if we ran it? You know, what would we do if we ran it? Well, we'd make it much cheaper, preferably make it free. The whole free public transport issue, by the way, no one's ever made much of an issue of it in the UK. I wish they would. I think it's a great idea. The first group of people you'd have to win over is the unions, because a lot of them think that fares are what pays their workers' wages. But it's a very interesting idea that I'd like to see us develop more. I think we'd have a huge programme of making the system much more accessible to disabled people. London Underground is horrendously inaccessible on many different ways. We'd expand the system, we'd build new lines out into... At the moment, the extensions that get built are the ones like you were saying about... Did you say about Pearson Union? Pearson, was it? Like, in London, they extended the Jubilee line to link Westminster, the seat of Parliament, to Docklands, the seat of big business, way ahead of having one between Hackney and Hexham, which are 2 working class areas. We'd extend prioritising working class areas. We would use technology together with staff, not instead of staff. What our bosses are trying to say is, you know, get rid of bring in automatic train operation so you can get rid of the driver, or bring in ticket checking technology so you can get rid of ticket sellers. We're not anti-technology, but we want to see technology used alongside the workers who operate it in cooperation with us, rather than instead of us. And the final thing I would say, I think, is the debates you're having about how an expanded public system would be funded. Remember what I said about there's no such thing as private funding, there's only private finance. It is a myth, proved over and over and over again to be a myth, that any urban transport system can self-finance. It can't happen, it's not possible. It needs subsidy. It needs subsidy. The amount it would have to charge, funding only comes from 2 places, the government or fair players. Right? Disregarding tiny little things like adverts on station walls, right? It only comes from those 2 places. People who say it comes from the private sector, it's a myth. It might come through them, it doesn't come from them. Right? And if all of it comes from fare payers, it becomes so expensive that no one travels, so you don't get any income from it anyway. It's not possible to run it without subsidy. It needs to be run with subsidy, and that makes sense anyway, because it's a public service, it's part of the infrastructure, isn't it? So I wouldn't hold up, for example, the Paris Metro to be a perfect system. I was on it on Monday and there was no staff and it was impossible to get in and out of and what have you. But it does have a bit of they do have a decent idea about funding. In France they have a system where every area sets the level of, but it applies everywhere, a transport tax. And it's a tax on the payroll. So any company that employs more than 9 people has to pay a certain percentage of its wages bill in a transport tax, and that has to go straight to the Transport Authority. So every employer in Paris pays 2% of its wage bill, goes straight to the Paris Metro. There's a rural area, Pays d'Auburn, I think it's called in France, where they've been able to use their transport tax to make all their public transport free. And the social effect of that has been fantastic. So I think I'm going to leave it there because I'm sure I've talked for longer than I should have done. Anyway, I have bought a few copies of the book if anyone wants to buy it. I sell it for £10, which I think is probably about 12 of your Canadian dollars. That's the thing. A much better deal than public-private partnership. Thanks very much.